I was a student at Cambridge, at Trinity College, Cambridge, and when I was in my, I suppose, second year there, aged 19, I came to realise that I was gay, although we didn't use that word in those days, but I was homosexual anyhow. And I did tell my father. My father was an Anglican clergyman who reacted very well, assured me that I was still his son and he still loved me, although according to Anglican Christian doctrine, he must hate the sin but love the sinner. And he assured me that he still loved me and I was still his son. And obviously he then told my mother and I think my brothers as well. So there was never a problem with my parents, and in that respect I'm very fortunate. I didn't know anybody in London really. Only one person who had preceded me from Cambridge, whom I'd known as a student at Cambridge, who came to the phonetics department 1 year ahead of me. So he was one person I knew in London, but apart from that, like any new student who's not a Londoner, I didn't know anybody here at all to begin with. To begin with, I just sort of, wandered around, and I found digs first of all in Muswell Hill, and then later, the next year, in Hampstead Garden Suburb. And from Hampstead Garden Suburb, I became familiar with Hampstead, and there I discovered a gay pub, I think called the William IV or something, in Hampstead. And that was the first place I ever found where I could meet other gay people. I never came across any overt homophobia, I do have to say that. At UCL, my experiences have always been very favourable in that respect. And so I suppose the next thing you want to hear about is when I was already on the staff and was arrested on Wimbledon Common for misbehaviour, shall we say. And my then head of department, head of the phonetics department, Professor A.C. Gimson, whom I naturally had to tell about this, was very supportive in that he made sure that I had legal representation for the trial. And I did. I had a barrister to represent me and was duly acquitted. So that was supportive on the part of UCL, and I've no complaints about that. Yes, I was very fortunate in that as I finished my master's, I was offered a post as assistant lecturer. I didn't have to apply for it. They came to me and said, would I like to stay on and teach in the department, which of course I said yes to. And 3 years later, I was promoted from assistant lecturer to lecturer. And then the rest of my career sort of followed. I, in due course, became reader and then professor, and now finally I'm Emeritus Professor. So I've spent my entire career at UCL. Okay, well, of course, I was very fortunate career-wise, but I was also very fortunate in terms of my romantic relationships. I first met a Jamaican, and through him I was able to get a suitable basis for my PhD, which I did already on the staff here at UCL. And I was interested in how people change their accents, how they change their pronunciation. And since this chap was Jamaican, I was able through him to contact a lot of Jamaicans living in London, what we now call the Windrush generation, and study how they changed their pronunciation from what it would have been back in Jamaica. To establish what the starting point was, I got a grant from the University of London to go to Jamaica, taking this friend with me, where he, of course, gave me an entry into Jamaican society. And so I stayed part of the time with his family in the country in Jamaica, and part of the time in Kingston, in the capital, where he had lived later on. And I was able to make lots of recordings and do my very best to learn myself to speak and understand Jamaican Creole. And on the basis of that, to design my questionnaire and so on to work with in London when I came to do my survey. And I duly got my PhD in 1971 on Jamaican pronunciation in London. That was then published as a book by the Philological Society. He was a friend, but we never lived together, and we sort of broke up bit by bit. And
but it seems to me he was one of the
one of the first people that I had a reasonably close relationship with. but he was never convinced that he was gay himself, and he in fact got married shortly after that. The marriage of course broke down, and he's now with a friend that he met later and has now been together with that friend as a civil partner for God knows how long. I did recently in fact re-establish contact with him, or rather he re-established contact with me, because he says his nephew found an article about me in Wikipedia, and that enabled them to get in touch with me and say hello again. That was from '64 onwards, and then I joined a psychotherapy group psychotherapy as it was known, because I was still worried about being gay, and don't forget that all gay activity was still illegal in those days. So anyhow, I went to this psychotherapy group, and in due course I came to the conclusion that the problem was not with me, it was with society, and that was of course the correct conclusion to reach. And shortly after that, or about that time, I met my current partner in a well-known gay pub in Earl's Court called the Coalhern. In fact, I was introduced to him one week. In those days, the Coalhern had three separate sections really. One was a mixed section of gay people, one was for leather men, and one was for mixed race people or interracial relationships, which was where I went. And because my first partner had been Jamaican and I was still attracted to black people, and my current partner is indeed black, and I was introduced to him by someone I knew there. And the following week we both went back hoping to meet the other one again. And I'd driven there by car, and so afterwards I offered him a lift home, and he came and sat in my car, and we talked and talked and talked and talked for hours. And finally I drove him back home to where he was living at that time, which was in Wimbledon. And we met up a few days later, and a few days after that, I mean a matter of within 3 weeks, he actually moved in to my flat with me. And we've been together ever since. 3 months later, we bought a house together. To do this, we had to get a mortgage and raise a deposit. I borrowed from my mother, and that plus my own savings was not enough for a deposit. And my current partner, Gabriel, gave me his savings, which he entrusted to me, and that gave us the deposit. And because he's black, he didn't want to be involved himself, and he thought it was safest if I did all the negotiating about getting the mortgage and buying the house. So I did, and the house was in my name. So I've always felt an enormous debt to him that he trusted me with his money. And indeed he moved in, we moved in together, and 4 years later we traded up, we sold that house, and we bought a 3-bedroom semi in a nice area in Merton Park, which is where we still live, and it's now a bigger house. We extended it and built a loft conversion and so on, so now it's a 5-bedroom house, and now it's worth £1 million. Well, the great thing was AIDS, which started in those days, and it never impinged on us ourselves directly because we were together, and so we weren't sleeping around, so we didn't run the risk of infection. But we had a lot of friends who were affected, many friends who died from AIDS, and like all gay people in that period were confronted with this terrible affliction of people dying from what was then an unknown cause. And well, it was tragic to lose friends and to go to so many funerals and so on. And it was up to gay men to organise themselves, and that's when the Terence Higgins Trust was set up. And I can't remember when I started supporting it, but I think fairly soon after it was launched, because if nobody else was helping us, we had to help ourselves. I wasn't really aware of life in Soho. I had known it long as a place where you could get gay magazines and so on, but I didn't really become aware of it as a gay centre, because I had always thought of Earl's Court as a gay centre. I wasn't aware of it as a gay centre until the bombing of the Admiral Duncan pub, which was in the news, of course, and very shocking. And later on, I joined the London Gay Men's Chorus, and I know that they had taken part in a concert for the Admiral Duncan outside it to show support. This is Nels Court. There was the Coleherne, and across the road from it was another pub called the Boltons, which tended to be frequented by rent boys, as we then called them, and prostitutes, in other words. Whereas the Coleherne was more respectable in that it wasn't rent, but it was a place for meeting other gay people. And that's really all there is to say. I mean, there were lots of gay men walking around on the street, and we would go there on Saturday nights to these pubs. I didn't, in those days, know about Gay's the Word. I don't think it had been founded. Later on, of course, it was, and once it existed in Marchmont Street, within easy walking distance of UCL, I did drop in there from time to time. And recently, clearing out my house of books, giving away as many as I could because they take up so much space. I suppose the other thing is that successive provosts have changed or attempted to change UCL's brand image, London's global university and so on, new slogans thought up, and fairly recently this great emphasis on diversity and a very welcome support for diversity, which is something that didn't exist as recently as when I was promoted to professor, because I remember they gave me an inaugural dinner after my inaugural lecture, and at that time, 1989, I didn't feel confident enough to suggest that my partner be invited to that dinner alongside with me, which I obviously would do nowadays. At some time, I suppose probably in the late 70s, early 80s, there was an older lecturer in the French department who sort of made himself known to me because somehow he had discovered that I was gay, and he knew that I was with Gabriel, my partner, and he sort of took me aside and told me that actually he was gay, but nobody knew this, and how nice it was to see younger people getting together as we were, and how inspiring that was, and how he regretted that he'd never been able to come out in public. And he gave me a copy of a book he'd written with his signature in it. So that was sort of nice, you know. What I really don't know is to what extent my gayness was widely known at UCL or among the student bodies. Recently, there is one of my former students who has come out as gay and who is now a teacher on our summer course, and I asked him whether he and his fellow students, undergraduates at the time, knew that I was gay, and he said yes, we did. So that suggests that at least those I was teaching were aware of it, but I never made a big thing of it, and I didn't discuss anything publicly with the students. Well, things are very different today. Don't forget that when I was first here, there was no gay press, there was nothing in print, no way of contacting other people, no listings, no way of finding out where there might be other gay pubs or saunas or whatever that there are nowadays, and no way of contacting people except face-to-face, really. Nowadays, people have these apps like Grindr, and I think the whole way of meeting other people has changed. I wouldn't know how to start about meeting someone new these days, but of course I don't need to anyhow. Well, and long before I was born even. I mean, the Victorians talked about Uranians, didn't they? And then with Krafft-Ebing, the technical term homosexual was launched and became general. And by the time I was a student, that was the term that was used in the press. And it was only later that gay came to be widely used. And certainly when I was an adult that it became used in the press as it is nowadays without further discussion, on the assumption that everybody knows what it means. And strange enough, it's also changed from being an adjective to being a noun. Now you can speak about gays as a plural, which you certainly couldn't do when first we used it as an adjective, a gay man, a gay person. Okay, well, recently I've published a book, and in it I wrote a letter to myself as a 16-year-old. And there, what do I say? I say, don't worry about sex. Most of the other boys at school are interested in girls, but you know you aren't. Have fun while you're young, even though at the moment it's still illegal for you to do what comes naturally to you in this connection. When you're 29, you will meet a man whom you will love and who will love you, and the two of you will spend the rest of your lives together. Decades later, when the UK no longer condemns such relationships, but on the contrary makes it possible for people to celebrate them publicly, you and he will become civil partners with the same legal rights as a married couple. You may find this difficult to believe now in 1955, but it's going to happen. Lucky you.